Sonia Hamill, and I'm with the New America Foundation, and I want to thank you all for coming, for joining us on this call. This is webinar number 3 in a series which are being hosted by the World Resources Institute, the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and the New America Foundation, with the idea of actually focusing on specific topics in the design of a regional cap-and-trade program and looking at experiences that have happened in existing programs and planned cap-and-trade programs in the U.S. and abroad. Our idea here is to offer anyone who's interested in knowing more about how these programs work and how they're designed with additional background on some of the features of cap-and-trade programs and some of the relevant design issues that need to be considered in their development. And obviously the two big programs that are in the process of being designed in the U.S. right now are the Western Climate Initiative and the Midwest states. And so we have a special interest in including stakeholders and people who are interested parties in those two processes. We have over 150 people signed up for this webinar today, and we're glad that all of you could be here. Generally, we've been looking at the last two webinars have done a basic introduction to cap-and-trade programs, and the last one looked at program scope and the point of regulation, that is, where do you consider intervening in the system to regulate in a cap-and-trade program. This one in particular will cover the electricity sector and options for how to consider the design of regulation in the electricity sector. Let me just say, and I'll repeat this again, that we have two speakers here, and you are all invited to ask questions both anonymously and by voice. We'd like people who are asking by voice to identify themselves, please. If you'd like to ask something anonymously or as it occurs to you, if you look at your site, you'll see a box where you can write questions in, and the speakers will be able to see those questions, and I will feed those questions to them at an appropriate time. If you'd like to raise your hand to be able to get in line to speak, to ask a question orally, please press *1 on your phone, and that will actually line you up, and we'll take questions in the order which they're asked at an appropriate point in the process. I'm very pleased today to introduce you to our speakers. We have two of just the very best speakers in the area of electricity sector cap-and-trade, and these are folks who have helped a lot with the RGGI process and are very familiar with cap-and-trade issues, but in particular have slightly different points of view on how the electricity sector might best be regulated. And let me just say that for the purposes that these folks, both Dallas and Rich, are very good colleagues, and they don't actually have a big fight here. But for the purpose of making this an interesting interesting discussion, and for pointing out issues where they do differ, we've asked them to make this a little edgy, or at least to point out their areas of difference. I will note that their areas of commonality are very large. They don't like debating, but we've asked them to present this in somewhat of a pointed fashion, even though they're very collegial. What we're going to do is, first Dallas Bertraw is going to present for about a half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we're going to take questions. Dallas, you're also welcome to take questions in the middle if there's a place where there's a convenient stopping place. And then we will take Rich's presentation next, and then we will have a chance for a very lively question and answer period on the details of the points of discussion. Let me just give you a quick intro for each of them. Dallas Bertraw is a fellow in the Environmental Division of Resources for the Future. It's a think tank. He's been on staff there since 1989, and he specializes in exactly this, in incentive-based environmental regulation. He's very widely published, and he's served as a consultant to states and federal agencies and to the utility industry and to many other environmental organizations. He holds a doctorate in economics and a master's degree in public policy. And Rich Cowart is the director of the Regulatory Assistance Program. That's also a nonprofit, and it's a technical and policy institute that specializes in advising government decision makers on energy and environment issues. Before that, Rich served as a commissioner and the chair of the Vermont Public Service Board, and he was there for 13 years under 3 different governors. He also has served as the president of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners and was chair of the National Committee of Public Utility Commissioners in their Environmental Resources and Energy Resources area. And Rich was in Vermont and is just coming in from his family's Christmas tree farm to be able to do this talk for us. So we're very grateful to him and to Dallas for doing this. So let me turn it over to Dallas to begin his talk.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's always still awkward to me with webinar technology, but it is convenient that we can save the carbon on traveling to be in one place at one time. I want to, before jumping into the substance of this presentation, I'm going to take 2 minutes, 3 minutes to try to establish context in the overall series of webinars that are being put on and in the larger set of choices that have to be made. And then, Rich, I'm going to ask you to pipe right in and agree or refine what I have to say, and then I'm going to turn back to the slides that we're going to go through. But I want to just take a second thinking more broadly than the technical issues that emerge in terms of thinking about electricity sector design to focus on what I think are the overarching priorities in my mind in terms of decisions that have to be made in designing a cap-and-trade program for carbon. Number one is the initial distribution or allocation of emission allowances. I have a point of view on this, but larger than that point of view, let me just set the, the decision that and the point of view you want to work on and develop, I think, is whether you think that an auction type of approach is the best approach in the long run for a cap-and-trade program, or if you think free allocation is something that you prefer, or some kind of transition. You need to keep that in one part of your brain for today's conversations. Even if you are accommodating sort today and think, oh, well, we should transition, you don't want to do it right away, or what have you, the architecture that we put in place is going to be very important on whether it's feasible and to see an auction being used for the initial distribution of emission allowances. And to tip my cards, yes, I think that an auction should be put in place as soon as politically and technically possible to do so. Second, and the implication of that is, well, what are going to be the effects on consumers and on product prices when you put a cap-and-trade program in place? And the design options that we're going to talk about here today could have very different effects on that. It would be politically very advantageous to soften the blow on consumers. It might help address equity issues. It certainly helps the political acceptability of climate policy. Maybe one could argue that it lets us go further in doing climate policy than we otherwise would be able to in the near term. The other point of view, though, and it's the one that economists tend to hold and that I hold, is that in the long run it's very important to see product prices reflect the scarcity value of carbon in the economy. So those are the two things, whether or not there should be an auction in the long run and whether or not we want to see product prices change or whether we want to try to soften that to the maximum degree possible, that are my driving considerations in thinking about the architecture of the electricity sector. And then I think there is finally a trump card that we come back to that has to do, well, what's legal? And we'll pick up on that, I know, later in the presentation. But Rich, rather than let me just blow hard on that, do you want to take 2 or 3 minutes and
Yeah, sure. I'll chime in on those fundamental points. This is useful in helping people to think this through. I would echo what Dallas says at one level and ask the question a little differently. The echo is that the point of regulation and decisions about allocation are separate questions for public policy, but they are intertwined. And it isn't, I don't think it's the case that those two questions should be answered separately. I think as we explore different architectural options, we'll see that we have different choices, a whole range of combination of choices depending on how we mix and match the answers to those two questions. But they are intertwined, and you have different options for allocation or auction depending on what you do with point of regulation, for example, and vice versa. The second point about prices does give us an opportunity to tee up this sort of fundamental choice that Dallas and I keep, coming up against. And that is, in the power sector, as compared with other sectors, is it the price that customers, end users, see that is going to drive carbon policy? Or is it the cost of service of the regulated entity as a whole that we need to keep our eye on? And the point that I will make is that I would like to see us design a cap-and-trade system for the power sector that reduces tons of carbon emissions consistent with our public policy goals, whatever our cap goal is, that reduces those emissions at the lowest reasonable cost to the cost of service. So that when we think about the power bill that customers are going to be paying, that we've been able to reduce our carbon footprint with the lowest impact on that power bill. And that's different from saying that we want to flow through the marginal cost of carbon reduction in prices to end-use consumers. And I think it's consistent with the way that we try to manage all other aspects of the power sector. So that's, I think I've answered Dallas's question by trying to put this in the context of the regulated power sector, which is different from competitive freewheeling competition in some other industrial sectors.
That was excellent. Thanks, Rich. And I think everyone on the line, I think that might sound a little bit vague or confusing, but I think it's going to help provide context for some of the technical issues that we're about to jump into. Okay, next slide, please.
And actually, I'm going to ask Dallas that you be careful, and Rich as well, to try and keep language really simple, because one of the comments that we've had on some of the previous webinars is that people were using language that was not completely obvious to people who are not familiar with these areas. So where possible, please, things like regulated entity, could use one quick descriptor before you go ahead with it. So there's your next one.
Okay, Rich, do you want to define a regulated entity?
Well, sure. In this, at least in the sentence I was using, that I was thinking about a regulated utility, which in some states is a vertically integrated utility that does generation and power delivery and customer service, your traditional utility. And in some other states, the regulated entity is something we often call the load-serving entity. And that's the regulated, I got to say it again, the regulated entity that has the obligation to serve customers and who is delivering power and delivering a bill for that power. Frequently, it's the local distribution company as well. That is the poles and wires company that serves a geographic area.
Great. Okay. So, and I'll try to do that, and you can stop me as I go, Sonia. So on this next slide, I'm putting up a picture here that shows the path of carbon through the economy with the electricity sector especially in mind. It harkens back to the previous webinar and where the point of compliance should be in the economy. An upstream type of approach would be, you could regulate fuel where fuel enters the economy, and could be done very reliably because it's very easy to predict the carbon content of fuel that's going to be used in the economy. So you could regulate where refinery and processors are, and at the wellhead or whatever. There's various specific proposals in federal legislation that would regulate upstream. As you move down through the economy, all the previous existing cap-and-trade programs that come to mind for me, including the SO2 program, the National SO2 program, the Regional NOx program, RGGI, that is the carbon trading program in the 10 Northeast states, and the European emissions trading system have all been at the point of combustion in the middle of this flow diagram. The power plants or other entities that are directly emitting carbon into the atmosphere is where regulation is applied. And so I'm calling that the potential point of compliance or point of regulation. Those are the entities that would have a legal obligation to surrender an emission allowance for every ton of emissions associated with their economic activity. But there's another alternative, which is to go further downstream and to regulate at the retail electricity distributors, which are the load-serving entities that Rich mentioned a moment ago. These are the companies that send your electricity bills to you, essentially. And the critical thing I want, if nothing else from this whole webinar that everyone on the call takes home, I'd like you to recognize the crucial architecture for CO2 is to distinguish the point of regulation from the point of allocation. You can look at this and see that it's not necessary to give away emission allowances for free to the entity that's responsible for complying with the regulation, because every entity along this flow chart is going to bear some portion of the cost when you implement a carbon cap on the economy. Some costs get passed upstream, some costs get passed downstream, and there's going to be a distribution. We call that the incidence of the program, who is bearing the cost of the program, upstream and downstream. And so if you think that giving away emission allowances for free forms some type of compensation, then it defies logic that you would give away emission allowances necessarily to the entity that's being directly regulated. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the question that's really we're teeing up right now is, where should the electricity fuel cycle be regulated? Should it be upstream? If not, then where should it be? And there's three options. Go ahead and click all the way down, because the next bullet is messed up. That first seller approach should be all the way onto the left. So I'm trying to identify three options. Sorry for the mistake on the slide. The first option is the source-based approach, which I mentioned is the type that's been used previously. A second is the load-based approach. And this has been the approach that the California PUC championed a couple of years ago when it announced its intent to put a cap-and-trade program in place for, oops, you went too far. Can you go back up on the slide? Thank you. When the California PUC announced its intent to regulate greenhouse gas emissions for about the 80% of electricity consumption that it directly regulates in the state of California. And this kind of approach the retail distribution company would surrender allowances for emissions used to meet load. The emissions, of course, are coming from upstream power generators, but the retail company would be responsible for compliance. And then there would have to be ex post estimates of emissions from both in-state and imported power. The first seller approach was the approach that was recommended by the California Market Advisory Committee, on which I served and which was established to advise the California Air Resources Board on the design of a cap-and-trade program. And the MAC recommended a first seller approach, in which the compliant party would be the entity that first brings power for sale onto the grid. And so for in-state generation, it would simply evolve to being the sources or the power marketers that take power from a generation source and schedule it onto the grid. For imported power, this would be the party that's identified on electronic transmission documents bringing power in from out of state. And so the idea of the first seller approach is that it's the party that's first selling or first delivering power onto the grid that be responsible. And since any in-state generator is notionally the first seller, then it looks a lot like a source-based approach, but it's not exactly the same thing as a source-based approach. So the distinction that Rich and I are probably going to go back and forth between a lot is the load-based approach and the first seller approach. And Rich is going to tell you about some of the virtues associated with a load-based approach. And I put yuck, who cares, because at this point you are probably feeling that way. But there are a lot follows from this for determining both the architecture in California and in the western states, if there's in the Western Climate Initiative, and also the kind of precedent that might exist for establishing federal architecture. Next slide. Okay, so the conclusion that I'm going to state is that, first of all, that the PUC's load-based approach was a product of necessity, and I think now's the time for more evaluation. 2 years ago, when the PUC was exercising leadership, it was doing so it was making a virtue of necessity. The only place where the PUC could regulate the power sector was the load-serving entity, and so that's what they chose to target. I think the load-based approach makes some sense, but it's not strictly a market. It's really, I would call it increasingly flexible, increasingly smart regulation, but it has some poor incentives and weak accountability for emission reductions. The organization and vision of the greenhouse gas market, go ahead, Sonia, and of electricity market reform are inherently linked. So let's pause on this for a second. And my point is that, at least in California, the California electricity sector is again reinventing itself, and there is an initiative well underway to introduce a day-ahead market into the California electricity sector starting next year. With a day-ahead market, that means that generators are expected to schedule in 10 to 20% of the power into this day-ahead market, and there's many, the ISO, the California ISO, which schedules the transmission grid and essentially is responsible for load balancing on the grid. It feels that there's going to be tremendous virtues associated with using the day-ahead market. So if this day-ahead market comes into being, it's going to be, you can think about this as electricity market reform, again, the next wave of this in California. And the organization and vision of the greenhouse gas market and the electricity market are going to be inherently linked, and the load-based approach is not consistent with market reform. If the market were to stay much the way it is now, the load-based approach would be more workable, I think, than if the if the electricity market reform goes forward. Next, click. There are justifications for a load-based approach that are offered around behavioral economics, and I'm going to argue that they are imprecise. It doesn't, you can kind of think this is true, but it's hard to know whether those justifications are really true or not. And next, Sonia, the hidden agenda is of a load-based approach is to soften electricity prices, and if that is, I don't mean to say hidden agenda in any pejorative term. I mean to say that I think, Rich, I think that what is accomplished, one of the things that is best accomplished by a load-based approach is that it easily softens the effect on electricity prices. But that is accomplished, I'm going to argue, by an allocation to load, not necessarily by load-based compliance. And my feeling, as I already indicated, is that at least in the long run, the argument that softening the change in electricity prices is a reasonable political goal, but it's bad architecture from an efficiency standpoint. And the load-based approach offers no off-ramp in terms of really how to undo this and how to electricity prices in the future rise to reflect the scarcity value of carbon. And so consequently, I would argue that this creates a windfall to electricity consumption that you're not going to see in natural gas consumption or in road transportation or in other ways that we use carbon in the economy. And it's going to cause allowance prices to rise, and it's going to raise the social cost of greenhouse gas policy. So I'm concerned about this putting in place an architecture that permanently softens the blow for electricity consumption. Okay, next. Okay, so there's 8 points in the debate, and I think that there's 3 of them in which there is, a lot of distinction gets made, but there's really not much of a difference. That's where these 3 are where the PUC's current activities, including portfolio planning and efficiency, it's argued are better served by a load-based approach. The impacts on consumers and producers are better served by a load-based approach, and that it's better for treating imported power. And then where there is a real difference, I think, hinges on the administration and incentives, and on the market reform, as I've mentioned, and overall integrity of the market. And there's a couple areas where the jury's still out. So I'm going to now take the remainder of my time and try to click through a slide on each of these points. Sonia? Okay, the PUC's role. So go ahead, Sonia. You better click down and fill up the slide. There you go. The PUC already plays an important role in ensuring that dispatch meets social goal. This is the California PUC, but this is also true for the PUC, that is the Public Utility Commission, and throughout most of the states in the country and throughout many of the western states, that they, to some extent or another, not as much as assertively as in California, they are involved in making sure that there is a cost-effective dispatch of the electricity grid and that various types of consumer benefit programs are met. In California, the PUC goes much further to establish priorities for the loading order, that is what resources get brought into play first for meeting electricity demand. The environmental risk adder is an extra kind of cost penalty associated with CO2 emissions. They're putting metering and decoupling policies in place that would decouple revenues from sales and shareholder and customer incentives, all of which are intended to provide to remove disincentives and to provide positive incentives for efficiency programs. And it's been argued that we need a load-based approach. Rich, I apologize for putting words in your mouth. I don't really mean to do that, but in general, it's been argued the load-based approach would do a better job because it keeps the PUC and it keeps the load-serving entities at the point of compliance because they are the ones that are going to be implementing more likely to be the ones implementing efficiency programs. And a load-based approach keeps them in this fundamental role and harmonizes carbon policies with efficiency policies in the economy. But I think it's a rhetorical point that doesn't really hold up. If you ask, well, would these policies end or should they end if there's a greenhouse gas cap and trade program? No, and it doesn't really make a difference for these types of policies, whether it's load-based or a first seller approach. Next slide, please. And let's click through this one, please. Yeah. There you go. In the impacts on customers and producers, again, this could get long and technical, and it invites modeling and it invites theoretical analysis, etc. But the point that I just want to assert at the beginning is that where markets determine price, and as Rich already indicated, the electricity markets are not strictly competitive markets, but where markets determine price, the wholesale power markets tend to be much more competitive than the retail delivery of electricity to the home. The wholesale power market is where power generators bring their power into the transmission grid and bid it into the market. It tends to be competitive over most of the nation and in the West. And where wholesale power price is competitive, then the incidence, that is who bears the cost of a cap and trade program, depends on technical measures of supply and of elasticity of supply and demand in the market, not where regulation is applied. So the same point sort of applies, economists learn this in graduate school. The same thing applies with all sorts of taxes in the economy. It doesn't necessarily, in most cases, it doesn't matter whether a tax is put on at the cash register or upstream where on the truck that's moving goods to the market or further up on the producer, that the incidence of that tax, the sharing of having to bear the burden of that tax gets borne throughout the product stream in an equal way. So to the extent that governs, and to the extent especially to the electricity market is going to move forward towards market reform, then there's not really a reason to argue that a different outcome is going to be achieved just because of where the point of compliance. Rather, the impact on consumers hinges on allocation. And under a load-based compliance, we could give emission allowances for free to consumers, and I think Rich is going to come to this, but I think that's what, in effect, Rich would advocate, and that this would tend to soften the change in electricity prices because whereas the load-serving entity would essentially have to surrender an emission allowance for all of its embedded emissions in the electricity that's delivering to customers, it would achieve in large those emission allowances for free, and then it would just have an incentive at the margin to try to squeeze out as many extra tons of emissions as possible so that it could have some allowances left over. If it did, it could sell them to somebody else, to one of the other load-serving entities, for example. And if it was short, it would then have to go into the market and buy them. And that is the way that consumers are really getting compensated under a load-based approach. Next slide.
And Dallas, I'm just going to mention that people are putting questions in writing. We appreciate that, and I'm going to feed them to you in a minute as you get to towards the end of this next section. And also for anyone who wants to get in line to ask a question, it's *1 is the way to get yourself in line, and we'll then take questions when Dallas is done about his presentation in the order in which they were received.
Thanks. We'll take questions in just a minute. So just this slide, the only point on imports is that a load-based approach was initially suggested a couple years ago by the PUC, and in part because the load-serving entity is buying power from in-state generators and it's buying power from generators out of state, and it could treat these different sources of power in a consistent manner if they were the ones responsible for compliance. But the difference between a load-based approach and a first seller approach when it comes to imports is nil. That is, that the same information is relevant in both cases, that the load-serving entity has to try to make an assignment of the emissions associated with imported power, and has to identify where the power is coming from, and the same is true under a first seller approach. So in summary, just on the first part of these slides that I went through, there are three areas in which I've talked about where I think that there is not really a difference between load-based approach and a first seller approach. That is how it affects PUC activities with respect to promoting energy efficiency, the effect on consumers and producers, and the effect on imported power. Now, maybe, I know time is short, but maybe we could take a couple questions now and then I can finish up.
Okay.
Sonia?
Let me just say that there were a couple of questions that were just on definitions. Let me ask them first. Someone asks, what does ex post mean?
What does ex post mean? Means after the fact. How's my Latin, Rick?
We'll take that.
After the fact. So when that was termed that there has to be a truing up ex post, the context of that was that under a source-based approach, the way we've seen them implemented previously, a power plant emits some tons of emissions, and monitoring, well, with electronic monitoring, it's on a 15-minute basis. There is a computer readout, and so the power plant is immediately responsible and can keep a checking account record type of thing of how many allowances it's responsible for, and then at the end of the year, it has to surrender that number of allowances. But when I use the term ex post, it is that the load-serving entity does not know immediately how many emissions are associated with the power that it's buying at any specific point in time. Instead, what has to happen in one form or another is at the end of the year, there'd be a truing up ex post after the fact and say, they may have a good idea as they go. They may have estimates, but they won't know exactly how many emissions that they're responsible for until the year is over.
Great. Okay. And then there's a second definitional question, and that someone asked, what does a PUC actually do? And the person says, what is their role? We have public utility districts in Washington. Are those the same?
How about Rich? If you have your mute button off, do you want to jump in? Because you're going to do a better job than me, having served as a regulator for many years.
A public utility district, or while Washington is somewhat unique in having so many public utility districts, and loosely speaking, a PUC and a PUD do the same thing. That is, they're responsible for the supervision of the power supply and customer service associated with it. That's the cleanest answer I can give you at the moment, but
we'll take that.
Can I just add on to that, Sonia? I mean, historically, public utility commissions came into being as a way to protect consumers in the market when there were, and also to some degree to protect suppliers from unfair competition, and to make sure that the regulatory compact, as I always characterize it, Rich, is that investors receive a fair rate of return on invested capital, but they also are responsible for meeting. They have an obligation to meet customer load at regulated rates. So that ensures that once a power supplier has a monopoly on the lines in your neighborhood, that they can't charge you whatever they want, but instead the regulator steps in and protects the consumer to make sure that there's not price gouging, and the regulator also plays a role to make sure that after having built those transmission lines and distribution lines, that the power supplier is getting a fair rate of return.
Sounds great. That was very helpful, actually.
And well, I'm going to make this more complicated by adding one more thing here. That in addition, in recent years, public utility commissions and also publicly owned utilities have come to understand that it's important to look at both ends of the wire when trying to figure out how to economically provide electricity service. And that is, they've gotten involved in making sure that energy efficiency services are also provided to customers. And that's along with things like renewable portfolio standards and other environmental overlays, the job of public utility regulation has gotten deeper.
Very important point for this conversation, because I was already talking about that. So Rich just helped establish the context that we look to. The public utility commissions are providing incentives to try to get the load-serving entities, those retail electricity companies, increasingly in the role of providing energy services to improve the efficiency of end use for electricity. And although others could do it in the economy, the load-serving entities are uniquely well-positioned because they're already in regular contact with customers and they have a lot of information. So we're increasingly putting an obligation on them to play that role. Sonia, should we go ahead, or
let me take one more question, I guess. I think you've really mostly answered this, but just to underscore what you've said, Dallas. There was a question about whether you could comment prospectively on the proposed regional and federal legislative and regulatory initiatives. Are they all looking at regulating at the same point of regulation, that is, with emitters? As of today, the person's question is, are emitters the only thing that's currently being regulated?
No, although it has been in play even in the last few weeks. There are 10 about pieces of federal legislation that have some important life to them, and the leading ones are the Lieberman bill and the Bingaman bill, and they use some mix of midstream and upstream regulation for different sectors of the economy. But I think it'd be too much of a diversion to try to get more specific about that for right now.
Fair enough. Let's proceed, and let me just again remind people that if you'd like to get into the queue to ask a question orally, it's *1. And also let me just tell the presenters that this takes once I press the button, it actually takes a little while for the slide to advance, so I'm doing my best.
Okay, next slide, please, Sonia. Okay, so now I'm going to offer 3 slides where I think there is a real difference between these different approaches. And the first has to do with administrative issues and incentives. And I fault the load-based approach. Oh, back one. I fault the load-based approach because I fear that it is really tremendously complicated. There are, in California alone, they say there's 15,000 electricity transactions hourly. And the true-up and assignment of estimated emission rates would have to occur ex post, and it would have to, we've already discussed what that means, and it would involve averages rather than sort of any instantaneous measure that can penalize the consumption of power from one source or from another. The use of averaging over sources in order provides it could severely weaken the incentives that those sources have to try to squeeze out emission reductions themselves. Now, I know, so that you're not confused later when Rich gets his chance to make his case, he's going to say, well, Rich is going to say, and I would agree, that there's really a tremendous opportunity for end-use efficiency in the electricity sector. But I'm going to also argue, and I don't know if Rich would agree with me, that there's also important opportunities for reductions on the supply side, both in terms of fuel switching, which means using less coal and more natural gas, and then less natural gas and more renewables in electricity generation, but also importantly within the order, they call it the merit order in which plants come into market, there tends to be a lot of variety in terms of the efficiency of those plants. And if you properly penalize them for their, inefficient plants also tend to emit more carbon, then you can get even a little bit of a reordering of which coal plant is going to dispatch first or which gas turbine is going to dispatch first, just on the basis of the relative efficiency when they're recognizing the fact that there's a price associated with carbon emissions. And one of the dark horses in this race that I am looking for is an expanded role for biomass co-firing in electricity generation. So I think that it's really important to provide those signals upstream to coal plants so that they maybe swap out 5 or 7% of the coal that they use for biomass, because that's a very quick way to achieve emission reductions of 5 or 7% from existing coal plants, even in the very much near term. load-based approach and first seller approach, however, both share a complicated treatment of imports. And my criticism is that the load-based approach expands that complicated treatment of imports to in-state power as well because of the difficult administrative issues in terms of aligning what the actual emissions are with the point of compliance, which is downstream at the load-serving entity. The next slide is about the point of electricity market reform, which I hinted at earlier with respect to what the MRTU stands for, is the Market Reform and Technology Upgrade Initiative. That is the, as I mentioned, the introduction of the day-ahead market in California electricity markets. And I want to just leave you with this, little warning that the bad will chase out the good if there is market reform, as is happening in California and is characterized a large portion of the electricity market over much of the rest of the country, is that there are roles for day-ahead markets, etc. And the reason that the bad will chase out the good, what that means is that imagine that you are a dirty generator with a high emissions rate. Then if there was a power pool, you would have the incentive to sell your power into that power pool, because on the other side of the pool, when the load-serving entity goes to that power pool, it cannot distinguish where it is getting the power from. It's buying power from the pool. So if you have an emission rate that's dirtier than average, you're going to hide by jumping into the power pool, if you will. And if you have an emission rate that's cleaner than average, then you're going to want to get out of the pool, because you're not going to be able to, at the prevailing prices for power purchased from the pool, you're not going to be able to capture the value of having relatively clean generation. So you'll want to leave the power pool and try to enter into some kind of bilateral contract with a load-serving entity. And then what you're going to have is essentially the dissolution of the power pool. The power pool is only going to, everyone in the power pool is going to be dirtier than average, and the power pool and the market reform and technology upgrade type of initiatives are going to dissolve, or going to be, in any case, incompatible with a load-based approach. So there are practical issues here that have to do with one's vision for the future of the electricity market and one's vision for the future of the greenhouse gas market. Okay, let's go next slide. And then I want to talk about just the integrity of the emissions market, because maybe this is showing my history with this, but I've been studying cap and trade programs back to before the SO2 program was viewed as wildly as a success and a potential exciting model that we could apply to other environmental problems. Before that, it was viewed as a real Trojan horse and something that one had to be really concerned about by most of the environmental advocates. And what happened in that transition to when cap and trade under the SO2 program became basically widely viewed as an advantageous policy tool in some context, was that there was 100% validity and accountability for emissions, and it's a transparent market with transparent electronic reporting. And I think environmental advocates woke up to the fact that they had more certainty and more reliability over the actual emission behavior and emissions reductions that were being achieved with cap and trade than they had by far over previous types of prescriptive technological programs that were always, involved hundreds of applications for variances for this or that for every specific types of operating facility. So cap and trade emerged as a really powerful tool for this generation of environmental policy, but that hinged on its very strong integrity. And I'm concerned about a load-based approach because it introduces a level of administrative complication that erodes that verification of emissions to some degree. Now, in other webinars, there's been some discussion of a certificates approach as a potential remedy for this. I agree that it is potentially a certificates approach, the tradable generation certificates or the CO2 reduction credits, QORCs, offer some administrative fixes that are rather elegant and solve much of the administrative complexity, but they leave, this is not the time to get into that in detail, but they leave some other important problems, including there still represents transfers of wealth among generators and between consumers and generators that I think that differ importantly from the most efficient design for a cap and trade program. So I don't want to offer a passing endorsement of those kind of approaches. I think that they deserve discussion, but there still remain problems with them. Okay, now I've just got a couple slides left, and then I'm going to conclude. And Sonia, so next slide, please. So where I think the jury is still out, there are 2 points to make here. This slide is that, well, why are we doing the Western Climate Initiative and the Midwest Initiative and the RGGI states? Is it to implement an architecture, suggest an architecture that might be adopted via the federal program, or is it to create helter-skelter so that the federal government has to act because we're doing so much at the regional level that the large corporations in America are going crazy and they actually turn to Congress for action? Or is it to put in place a architecture that is supposed to survive after the federal government acts? And if you adopt one of those 3 types of notions about why you're doing what you're doing at the regional and state level, it might lead you to a different kind of intuition about the design of the electricity sector within a regional cap and trade program. But I think that it is clear that the load-based approach is not in play at the federal level, so it doesn't offer a kind of example that the feds are going to embrace. It might, Rich might make the point that load-based approach is a good approach at the regional level to coexist with some type of federal program. But this is anyway an issue that I think has to be discussed explicitly, and I think the jury's still out. Next slide. The other issue where the jury is still out has to do with legal issues, and there are 2 here you have an economist talking about legal issues, and Rich is the lawyer. He's going to be up next. But maybe everybody else on the call can understand this at about the level I do, and which is somewhat below the level that a lawyer would understand. There are 2 important legal issues that constrain what the states and regions might be able to do. One of them has to do with the Commerce Clause, which requires consistent treatment if a state is going to try to regulate economic activity inside and outside that state. It can't really regulate activity outside that state, but can regulate goods and services that come from outside the state. It has to do so in a consistent manner. And it appears to me, to the layperson, that the prevailing wisdom is both a first seller approach and a load-based approach would both pass the Commerce Clause. The second is the Federal Power Act, which reserves to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission the authority to regulate the transmission lines, the interstate transmission lines, and that the states do not have the prerogative to do that independently because their states are connected to the interstate transmission system. And looking at this, and if you kind of squint your eyes and, having listened to a lot of conversations between lawyers about this, I'd say it's about a 50-50 toss-up about whether or not the first seller approach will survive the Federal Power Act. So even though I'm going to argue that it has some very important virtues, the trump card may be that it doesn't survive the Federal Power Act, whereas the load-based approach, I think everyone agrees, probably would survive the Federal Power Act. So my conclusion is that the first seller approach is an architecture that can be expanded to an economy-wide and nationwide cap-and-trade program, and that the stakes are high for consumers and for companies for the evolution of climate policy, and I think it's going to be difficult to unwind if the Western Climate Initiative folks start down the load-based path and then decide that's not where you want to be. It'll really hamstring what can be done over the long run with cap-and-trade at the regional level. Okay, Sonia, back to you.
Dallas, that was fantastic. You covered an enormous amount of ground, and I think you also laid out some of the basic issues into which Rich can now put his both points of agreement and his places where he disagrees. Let me just remind people we're taking questions in writing, and a number of you have been taking advantage of that. I will actually hold, I'm looking at the questions that you've got. I'm going to hold them because I think some of them are going to get handled in this next part, but we'll come back to them at the end where we have time for discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich Cowart.
Okay, this is Rich. Oh, you've got me up. All right, good. As always, I have to say I enjoy this dialogue with Dallas, and I hope that wherever we end up in this, both in WCI and in other places, that this debate about the point of regulation and the means of allocation will end up leading us all to a significantly better program than I think we were headed for a year or so, or even 2 years ago. So let me begin essentially by making my fundamental point. I'm going to argue that a load-based cap and trade for the power sector has significant advantages because I believe it's totally consistent with the whole idea of cap and trade to create a system that will uncover and deliver the lowest cost savings, the means of reducing carbon at the lowest cost to end-use consumers. And that's the principal goal of cap and trade in the first place, and I think a load-side cap does that. I do want to emphasize that when I talk about a load-side cap, I am talking about an integral part of an economy-wide cap and trade program. This is not an attempt to somehow segregate the power sector or accomplish reductions in the power sector without using the advantages of trading, because I think there are very significant advantages to trading in carbon, just as there are, for example, in having a renewable portfolio standard, something we're getting quite used to in the power sector. Now, if you go to the next slide, go to the next slide. You've already heard about me. I took this slide from the Stern Review from the UK from a couple of years ago, just to remind us that ultimately the climate scientists believe we have a really long way to go here. We're going to have to make very significant reductions in the carbon footprint of our economies in order to stabilize climate change. And go to the next slide. And as you'll see on this slide, this is a sort of a typical slide, this one from US EPA, in which they're trying to figure out where the reductions are likely to come from in the United States. And that big blue portion, the biggest portion of the reductions, is slated in this model by EPA to come from the power sector. So not only are we going to have to make very significant reductions over time, we're going to have to make them in the power sector. And I want to leave you with a fundamental question, two fundamental questions that I think we need to ask and I think we need to answer as we design cap and trade for the power sector. Those questions are these. For any given policy proposal, we should be asking ourselves, how many tons will it save? Number one. And number two, we should be asking ourselves, how much will it cost consumers per ton avoided? I think that if we force ourselves to do this analysis before we design and commit to the architecture of a cap and trade program, then we're going to be able to find the best design. And one of the things that troubles me about the current debate on cap and trade is that we have not really rigorously done this analysis for the different architectural options that are in front of us. You know, Dallas and I can have this conversation as many times as we like, but for different power regimes and different regulatory structures in different states and regions, we don't know the answer to these two questions. And so I am going to suggest that what you're hearing from us at this point are some conjectures about what will work and how much things will cost, but we really haven't modeled it yet. Next slide. Now let's think logically about where the reductions in the power sector are going to come from. And it's important for us to understand that there are these logical sources of emissions, and as we design an architecture, we ought to be asking ourselves, okay, where are we going to find the reductions? Number one, we need to find reductions by reducing consumption. Cost-effective energy efficiency is by far the most desirable means of reducing carbon emissions. It's the cheapest way, and we know that those resources exist and can be tapped in quantity. Secondly, we could lower the emission profile of new generation. That is, what's going to get built tomorrow, what's going to get built next year, what's going to get built 5 years from now. How do we design a mechanism that's going to inherently force either generators, investors, or the buyers of power, or all three, to decide they're going to build cleaner rather than not cleaner new sources? And third, we could redispatch the existing fleet. We can do things to the existing fleet to try to clean up the mix. Just to give you a preview of where I'm headed on this, redispatching the existing fleet by virtue of a price signal turns out to be a very expensive way to try to reduce emissions. And that's something that will emerge as we go along. Okay, so you've heard me say my two basic questions. How much is it going to cost consumers per ton reduced? And now I am speaking sort of from the position of someone who sat on a lot of rate cases and also participated in a lot of utility planning exercises over the years. And I guess I want to make the following kind of challenge. The challenge would be this. I think utility ratepayers should be obliged. It's fair to ask them to pay for the cost of cleaning up the mix to the degree we've decided this many tons has to get stripped out of the power sector. But I think we should try in every way we can to avoid a situation in which we know that the actual cost of cleaning up that amount of tons is X dollars, but that ratepayers end up paying 2X or 3X or 4X by virtue of the structure that we've chosen. And that is a cost of service-based approach to the reduction of carbon in the power sector. And the reason I say that is that as a political matter and as a realistic matter, and as a matter of fairness, all three, we are not going to be able to come close to making the significant reductions we need to make in this sector if the pain of doing so is that ratepayers have to make significant transfer payments and provide windfall gains to investors in certain kinds of generation in order to buy a cleaner mix. So my goal, I think, is the same as the goal of those who promote cap and trade. That is, let's design a system that reduces emissions at the least cost to society. And I guess I have to say that in this context, transfer payments from ratepayers in the form of windfall gains to generators are not something that I think we should view as, oh, we don't care, it's just a transfer payment. Next slide. This slide you can hardly read, and it's hard to explain it in depth, but it's in overview. It's quite simple. This is the result of a study by the McKinsey consulting firm about opportunities for carbon reductions in the U.S. economy. And I've just pulled out with those green ovals two parts of it. On the left-hand side, what you have are carbon reductions that actually save money, and energy efficiency provides carbon reductions that end up costing consumers less than zero because the avoided costs pay for the cost of the measure. And on over there on the right-hand side, there's a little oval that reminds us that other choices turn out to be actually expensive. And in this case, changing out relatively inexpensive coal and replacing that with much more expensive natural gas generation is something that actually costs consumers and costs the economy, in this case, roughly $50 a ton is the estimate McKinsey puts on it. So it's just important to have in mind that not all carbon reductions are the same, and we are looking for a system that's going to give us as much of the stuff on the left-hand side of this chart as possible, and we hope less of the measures on the right-hand side that are actually much more expensive. Next slide. Now, we do have a lot of tools when we think about the power sector, and I want to pause here for a moment and remind everybody that we are talking about a sector that is unique in many respects, including the history and manner of regulation of the sector, and that we would not be having the same conversation if we were talking about the oil industry or the steel industry or the widgets manufacturing industry that are not subject to end-to-end regulation the way electricity is. But because the electric sector is so important and because it is characterized by monopoly characteristics and because we have a history of regulation and the institutions of regulation that already exist for the power sector, we have options available to us in the power sector that we don't have in other sectors. As you've already heard from Dallas, that we have cap and trade options, generator side or load side, and then we also have some non-cap options, for example, a carbon tax. Today we're talking about the two cap and trade options. Next slide. As we said earlier, there are these two overriding architectural questions, the point of regulation and the method of allocation. And as I think both of us have said earlier, these end up being intertwined, and what you want to do with one influences what you want to do on the other. Next slide. This is similar to Dallas's drawing about the point of regulation. And here we're showing the options available to us all the way from upstream regulation with some kind of a carbon tax or a carbon cap imposed on mines and at the wellhead, down through power plants to a load-serving entity, or perhaps conceivably we could have a carbon tax imposed on end-use customers. But the reason I put the load-serving entity in yellow in the middle of this drawing is to make a point. The load-serving entity in the power sector is uniquely situated in the midstream of commerce. They are the entity that chooses what to buy, therefore they can reach out into the field of generation and choose to buy clean rather than not clean. And they also have direct relationships with end-use customers, which means they're in a position to help customers become more efficient, and therefore they can deliver end-use energy efficiency services, which, as we've seen in the prior slides, provide a huge reservoir of low-cost carbon-avoiding options. A simple statement. Generators don't have relationships with end-use customers. Generators have there's no business model in which a generator will reach out to end-use customers and help those customers conserve power. And whereas regulated load-serving entities are situated in order to be able to do that. Next slide. California and Oregon have thus far expressed very substantial interest in what we've termed load-side cap and trade. And the purpose of this slide here is simply to remind us that it is cap and trade, and therefore the tons that are created and accounted for, retired, or traded in a cap and trade system can still be treated like all other tons and in an economy-wide cap and trade. It's just that the point of regulation for dealing with those tons, the responsibility for retiring them, rests with the load-serving entity rather than with the generator. And one way of thinking about this is to think of it as a carbon budget for a load-serving entity that the load-serving entity has to live within, and they either have to, as they purchase power, they can spend out of that budget and retire tons, and in relation to, or in proportion to the emission characteristics of the power they're buying. And if they end up at the end of a compliance period with a surplus because they've managed well, they've bought clean power, their customers have gotten efficient, they have tons to sell. If, on the other hand, they have not managed so well and they've gone into the market and bought high-emitting power, then they're going to have to buy allowances or offsets in the usual fashion, and they're going to have to pay for that. So it does deliver a price signal with respect to the cost of carbon on a per-ton basis to the portfolio manager of the load-serving entity. Next slide. Thinking about the way a load-side cap would work, I believe it has a number of advantages. Because it provides an incentive directly to load-serving entities to deliver end-use energy efficiency, it can lower the total societal cost of the carbon program. The greater the penetration is in cost-effective energy efficiency, the lower the cost of the carbon program. And this puts the burden of regulation right on the backs of the entity that's in a position to go and capture those efficiency savings. Second, it will lower consumer costs because it reduces transfer payments that arise under the systems, the cap-and-trade systems or the carbon tax systems that environmental economists tend to like. Third, the environmental advantage is that if we can lower the cost to consumers, over time we're going to be able to make deeper cuts with less political resistance to further reductions over time. And I think there also are institutional advantages in the sense that we have regulated distribution utilities and load-serving entities with portfolio management obligations already, and making them manage those portfolios to minimize carbon is totally consistent with the traditions of utility regulation. The legal advantage Dallas has already noted. There are actually a number of reasons why a load-based cap for states and regions is actually legally superior to a generator-side cap. We can accomplish more through the regulation of load-serving entities that are fully regulated by the states, or in the case of public utilities, regulated by the citizens or the city councils or the PUD commissioners. Those are state regulatory bodies, and they're regulating retail sales. They have jurisdiction over those retail sales, and therefore they're not preempted by FERC, and you don't have Commerce Clause challenges. Next slide. I will make one final point here about the political problems of an auction. I mean, one of the good things to come out of this whole discussion is that, and this is something Dallas and I totally agree on, and that is free allocation to generators in the manner that we did it in the acid rain program is the wrong way to go for carbon. And at a minimum, if you have a generator side cap, there should be a very substantial auction of allowances in order to minimize the windfalls. And I just want everybody to have that in mind. And but it does yield a political challenge. Do you really think that Congress is going to do that when they enact federal legislation? Or do you think that in the great halls of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., that what we're going to see is a real mishmash? And if you are concerned that we might not get that auction and those revenues from an auction might not go back to ratepayers, then the advantages of a load side cap start to look a little stronger. Next slide. Oh, you went back. I didn't even notice. Here I want to make a point. This slide, actually, I give a lot of credit to Dallas and his colleagues for educating the RGGI decision makers about the problem of windfall gains. And the problem of windfall gains in the power sector arises wherever there's a market for wholesale power that has a single price auction characteristic, and that characterizes all of the markets the major markets that exist in the U.S. today. And it characterizes the MRTU market that Dallas is promoting so warmly for California. And in that market, the last unit to be dispatched sets the clearing price in that time period for all the power that's sold during that time period. And the last unit to be dispatched in almost all hours, in almost all markets, will be a fossil unit. So what happens in these markets is that the units with the lowest incremental costs, the marginal cost to operate in the next hour, which include hydro and nuclear and wind, let's say, which tend to be the cleaner units, they don't set the clearing price. The unit that sets the clearing price is going to be a fossil unit. It's going to be a gas unit or a coal unit. And when you raise the price of power from that fossil unit, as shown here on this slide, Plant C is that new power plant with a higher clearing price. Because you make them pay a carbon tax, or you make them buy allowances, which is in effect the same thing, they raise their price. Now, Dallas has told you that that is a good thing. They have to raise their price, and therefore they're entering the market because they're now a higher priced unit because the price of carbon is embedded in their price. It has the effect, though, of raising the price of every other unit that is being dispatched in that hour. And so consumers don't just pay the marginal cost of the carbon emissions for that last unit. Consumers pay the carbon bump for all megawatt hours being dispatched through that market. And that ends up providing transfer payments to all the generators. In this case, Plant A and Plant B also get the extra revenue associated with those sales that consumers have to pay. Next slide. Now, in the European Union, I'm going to go quickly here. In the European Union, they gave free allowances to generators. Generators raised their prices. Consumers just had to pay. And it has turned into a big political scandal almost in the European Union about their carbon trading system, because the consumers ended up having to pay much more than the cost of that it actually took to reduce carbon in the power sector because of these transfer payments to generators. Next slide. Now, Dallas has argued, and I've agreed with him in a source-based system, that we should require generators to purchase allowances, because that does minimize the windfall gains, at least to the fossil units. But an auction of allowances, which is what would be required here if you're going to make the generators pay, an auction of allowances still leaves us with some problems. Ratepayers will pay more, as I just explained, because fossil units are setting the clearing price, and then that increased value is going to be received by the nuclear and hydro and wind and other lower emitting resources in the dispatch order. Second is the auction revenue erosion problem. Do we really believe that we can create multi-billion-dollar auctions and that the revenues are actually going to get returned to ratepayers? And then finally, there is this problem which I call the realities of marginal generation costs. And here you have to ask the question, and this requires serious study. Ask the question, how high does the price of carbon have to go before you actually change the dispatch of the existing fleet of generators? Next slide. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. It takes a high carbon cost to change the dispatch of the existing fleet. And here's just the practical realities of the huge fleet of power plants that exists in the U.S. today. The nuclear, hydro, and wind units, whatever's out there that has very low operating costs, are going to run, because they're going to run according to their marginal costs, not their historic all-in costs. And so we know that those units are just going to run. And we don't have to pay them anything extra in order to get them to run. Then we have a huge fleet of coal plants that have low fuel costs. And historically, they are much lower cost to run, than gas plants. And this is particularly true with the price of gas going up. This slide shows you the difference between gas at $6 and gas at $8. And you can make your own guess about the future price of gas. But with gas at $8, you basically need a carbon tax or a carbon auction price well over $60 a ton, or in this slide shows $70 a ton, for existing gas plants to look cheaper to an operator, to look cheaper to a power market than a coal plant. And so you have to have a very big carbon tax in order to make significant changes in the dispatch. Now, I agree with Dallas that at $50 a ton or $60 a ton of carbon tax, you can get relatively small changes in the dispatch order, and it is possible to make some improvements. But please remember that the cost of imposing a $60 a ton carbon tax isn't just paying $60 for the ton that you reduced. You've raised the clearing price of power across many megawatt hours. And across those many megawatt hours, ratepayers are going to be paying significantly higher electricity prices to get a relatively small change in the total tons emitted. Next slide.
Richard, I'm just going to give you a time check, which is that it's 3:20 right now. We want to probably wrap this up in about 10 minutes for the slides so that we have a chance. We have a lot of questions people are asking. So please.
That's good. I was figuring to go to 3:30. So
okay, great. Perfect.
I think we're fine. So this next slide shows the results of a study done by an analyst at the Electric Power Research Institute. And this particular slide is from the Midwest, shows the fleet, every power plant in the upper Midwest region of the United States, a coal-heavy region. And it basically asks the question, what happens in this particular slide at $25 a ton? He also studied it at $50 a ton. What happens if we have a carbon tax of $50 a ton and we impose that cost on the existing power plants that are out there? And what Victor Niemeyer concluded was that if you just look at the existing fleet, even a $50 a ton carbon tax has very small impact on changing the dispatch. You get a 4% reduction in the total emissions of the existing fleet in the region, while you just about double the wholesale price of electricity. So it's, from the point of view of decision makers, it's a very expensive way to get a relatively small reduction in emissions. Next slide. This quotes some of the results of that EPRI study, and also makes the point that even in Texas, which is a very gas-heavy region rather than a coal-heavy region, you have the same problem, because you're raising the price of gas, which is competing against other gas, and you can pay a lot to have gas chasing gas, but it doesn't reduce emissions very much. Next slide. And this shows pretty much the same result. Next slide. Now, here I'm summarizing again my point about costs, that if we're not careful, through a carbon tax or through an auction, supply-side based cap with an auction, we can create really high-cost tons, because fossil units almost always set the clearing price, and we can find ourselves dramatically increasing electricity rates without reducing emissions very much. Next slide. Next slide. It's also I guess on some days I think depressingly, and on other days I think not surprisingly, difficult to reduce emissions by imposing carbon taxes or imposing high prices on end-use consumers. Now this cartoon is just here to make the point of something that we all know, which is that the price of gasoline has gone up quite significantly in the last 18 months or so. And the impact of that price increase on consumption has been pretty small. The increase that we've experienced in the past few months is equivalent to well over $100 a ton carbon tax. And you all probably are aware that in Congress, when people talk about carbon taxes or putting price caps on the cap-and-trade system, they're talking about price impacts far less than $100, more like $10 or $20 a ton. And what this means is that if we imposed a carbon tax of $10 or $20 a ton on generators and flowed that cost through to ratepayers, yeah, it would increase prices. But its impact on consumption would be very small because the demand for electricity is highly inelastic. Next slide. Now, there is some good news here, though, and this takes a little bit of thinking through. But I have studied this on a number of power systems and have learned, as a lot of other people have learned, that utility-sponsored energy efficiency programs are a lot more powerful than rate increases if what you're trying to do is reduce consumption and thereby reduce emissions. Air regulators are really surprised to learn about this, that they could reduce emissions from the power sector by 5 or even 10 or more times for the same amount of dollars in cost to consumers if we spend the money on energy efficiency programs rather than just creating an across-the-board rate increase. Rate increases in the power sector are a very expensive way to reduce consumption. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the generation side. The good news here is that load-serving entities, as I mentioned, are in a position to deliver end-use energy efficiency, which, as we've seen, is the lowest cost way to reduce carbon emissions in the sector. But it's important to remember that load-serving entities are also portfolio managers. That is, they decide what to buy. Now, Dallas talks about a system in which load-serving entities are blind to their purchases. That is, they don't know what they're buying, and they can't control what they get. And that is a system that's in place in some places in the world, for example, in the United Kingdom. But in the United States, load-serving entities do have a significant opportunity to control what they buy and to make investment decisions about their power portfolio. For example, we have renewable portfolio standards in effect in many places in the U.S., and that's because we know that load-serving entities are in a position to go out and commit to buying renewable resources. Similarly, they're in a position to go out and commit to buying a portfolio of resources that would allow them to live within their carbon budget. And I'm told, if you think about this, I think you'll appreciate that it is almost always the case. I'm told that the investors in power plants are not going to be building power plants on spec. They tell me that they're only going to build major new power plants when they have a contract with load-serving entities to buy the power. So load-serving entities are in a position to go out into the market and to say to investors and generators, hey, we'll sign up for your new power plant, but we're facing a carbon budget. And so in order for us to commit long-term to buy power from your plant, we want you to build a clean plant. In other words, there's a market-based mechanism for directly affecting what gets built. And what gets built is one of the principal ways that we're going to reduce the carbon profile of the sector over time. Next slide. I mentioned a minute ago the renewable portfolio standard. And I want to ask you to think about how that works and why we're so happy with it. And I do find it intriguing that in Congress there is a lot of discussion and support for renewable portfolio standards, as there are in now a majority of the states. A renewable portfolio standard is an obligation imposed upon load. It's a load-based portfolio requirement. And so it is not much of a stretch. It's not a radical departure to say, oh, well, let's regulate carbon the way we have promoted renewables. That is through a load-side obligation imposed upon the portfolio manager. And not only that, we can trade allowances. We can trade tons of carbon the same way we trade renewable energy credits through a renewable portfolio standard. So it's consistent with the RPS, which is well understood to work reasonably well. And not only that, to be cleaning up the mix at low cost to ratepayers. The nice thing about a renewable portfolio standard, if you think about it, is the load-serving entity's got to go out and buy, let's just say wind for the sake of this one. They got to go out and buy wind, and they have to pay the premium to buy wind. But they don't also have to pay a premium to coal or a premium to a nuclear generator in order to go and buy the wind. And so the cost of the RPS is much more closely and directly related to the actual cost of supplying wind. And we didn't have to raise the clearing price of all megawatt hours, the price of power generally, in order to get that load-serving entity to contract with a wind farm. Next slide. I think I'm getting to the end here. On this slide, I essentially just make the point that Dallas and I have both agreed on repeatedly, and which is that if you're going to have a supply-side cap, an auction is the better way to go. And I would hope that if the WCI does go with a supply-side cap, that we do it in such a way that we send a very strong signal to Congress that we need to do that, and we need to do that in a very clean and well-protected way. Next slide. We can skip this. We can skip that one. I will just leave this cartoon up because I like it so well. It does just remind us that as we ask ourselves, well, what are we doing in the WCI to influence federal policy? We need to make sure that what we do works best in terms of reducing tons for the lowest ultimate cost to consumers, so that as time goes by, we can actually make the significant reductions we need. And I think we should not fool ourselves into thinking that so far Congress has got this right, and that we should just go along with the sort of inside the beltway approach to this, these issues that we've seen so far. Can we do the next slide? Maybe we're getting down to the end here. Skip that one. Let's go to the next to the last slide. I think it's 35.
Is that the one?
Yeah. I just want to close just by giving you some perspective on some of the key points that Dallas has raised so ably. And because there is something of a worldview difference between the utility economics and traditional environmental economics. And it is true that it seems to me that the approach taken by most cap-and-trade economists is that basically what they prefer is a carbon tax. And because what they're looking for is what I'll call a top-down price-driven model. You want to introduce, in this model, you want to introduce the cost of carbon into the price of everything in the economy, and then let the decisions about what happens next on down through the chain of commerce be made as a result of that price signal. A load side cap, on the other hand, grows up out of the traditions of utility management and utility regulation, and it's based on the idea of portfolio management. And so imagine this one emerging out of the portfolio up and pushing up in the stream of commerce by virtue of a price signal felt by the load-serving entity rather than a generic price introduced into the cost of fuel. And excuse me. And that does reflect something of a worldview difference, and it's helpful to understand the difference and to realize that, as I said, one emerges from the traditions of environmental taxation, environmental cap-and-trade design, and the other emerges from the traditions of portfolio management as practiced by utilities and utility regulators. And in this context, I'm going to just, in about 5 sentences, respond or tee up some of the issues that Dallas has pointed out and respond to them. I do believe that we can create a load-based cap-and-trade system that does not harm the day-ahead market in the manner that Dallas is concerned about by tracking and trading attributes through that market. And the people who write the software that do that tracking and trading say that we can do this at low cost. So I think that we can solve the problem that Dallas is talking about. I agree with Dallas that co-firing coal-fired power plants with biomass is a potential strategy for lowering carbon emissions, and would simply point out that a load-side system does that just as well as a gen-side system. Because under a load-side system, the power buyer would have an incentive to say to the generator, hey, if you co-fire with biomass, then you're a more attractive power seller to us, and we'll pay for that the same way we'll pay for any clean power. With respect to the complexity of this system, I guess I just want to make a generic point that however many thousands of transactions there are in power markets every year, those transactions are all handled by complex computerized systems, both to ensure that at all times the power system, the grid itself is balanced, and that the power quality remains what it needs to for reliability. And also to ensure that at the end of the month, the generators get paid and the entities that are responsible for consuming power pay them. And we've learned in the East through the generation information systems in effect in the Eastern power markets that you can track megawatt hours from their generators to the load-serving entities that purchase the power, and that doing so is really just a matter of applying software to the power flows. So that it's complicated, and there are a lot of transactions, but the New York Stock Exchange is complicated, and the New England power markets and the PJM power markets are complicated, but the software exists to solve a lot of these problems. I think that's it. I think I should stop and take questions.
That's great. Rich, that was really great. And actually, a number of the questions that have come in, I think that people have been, that you've been answering kind of as we go. Let me just say that several of you asked about the slides, whether you'd be able to download them or go back and study them. There is a lot of information on these slides. I've heard this presentation now, I think this is the 5th time, and I still picked up new things and subtleties that I hadn't heard previously. Just to let you know that Laura Burns here at New America Foundation has sent the slides out to everyone who was registered, pre-registered for this event. So your email should have the slides in it now. In addition, we have the synced recording and presentation, and at some point soon we will let you know where that's loaded up to. We're currently looking for a good way to put it up to the website so that you can go back and actually listen to the whole stream and watch the slides at the same time at your leisure. And that's true for all of the sessions that are being presented here. All the webinars will be available in that format shortly. Let me see. We've got 2 people who are lined up. Let me just remind you that if you want to ask a question in person, that this is the time. I'll take the first 2 questions in order, and then we'll come back to some of the things that people have written about and pick up on some of those as well. Let me take the first question now.
Hello, this is Salmia Shastri with PG&E here in California. We have grappled with this question on the point of regulation for many, many, many months now, and we've had the benefit of both Rich Cowart and Dallas Bertraw's input into deciding this. Now, we are a load-setting entity here in California, and our priorities for a cap-and-trade system are environmental integrity, so getting the lowest emissions, getting the most emissions reductions at the lowest cost, while protecting our customers and protecting the cost impacts to them, while providing a model to the national system. So we thought about this a lot, and we are looking at this from a utility perspective. And we and all of the other investor-owned utilities in California have come to the perspective that a first seller or a source-based system is much better at keeping customer costs down, at protecting the environment, and at serving as a model for a national system while protecting reliability. And I had a couple points that I wanted to make. One was that, this idea of the windfall profit, we've looked at the costs, and for us, we really think that the costs under the systems are pretty similar in terms of energy prices, because the windfall profit issue in the UK was something very different from the way Rich used it in the presentation. The windfall profit there was because they gave allowances to generators for free. So the generators had this good which they could sell, and because it had an opportunity cost, they also included it in their price of electricity. So even though they got it for free, they were including it in the price of what they sold, and that's what has led to the billions of more profits that we've all heard about in the EU ETS. Now, what Rich is talking about is something very different, and that's basically that cleaner generators would get more money because they are cleaner. And in the way we've looked at it, we've seen, we are negotiating renewables contracts, and renewables contracts don't give their energy to us at the price of, the cost of service. They really are incorporating the fact that there's a lot of demand, that there's scarcity, and in our estimation, they would include the CO2 price in the contracts that they would give to us. So the prices for our customers would end up being the same in terms of generation. However, you have this enormous complexity on the load-based cap side. I have talked to APX, who said that who's built the GAT out in the West, and what they are talking about is a disaggregated emissions attribute system. There is no way to track generation to load in a market like we have in California. What they are talking about is having...
Excuse me, this is the moderator. I'm just going to ask that you kind of get to your question.
Okay.
It's interesting. Actually, your thinking is really interesting in terms of how you're getting there, but if you could just pose the sort of end question, I think it will help, just to tighten it up.
Okay, sure. So, I guess the point is that with what I hear Rich suggesting is the TX or Quarks type system, where you have three different goods. In the you have the good, the electricity market, you have the allowance market, and then you have an attributes market. And it seems like that's very, very complicated and would lead to a lot of confusion in the market and actually inhibit people taking part in the market and could lead to some arbitrage. And this is maybe a question for both Rich and Dallas. I mean, how do you think that would work, where you would have three different markets? Because you can't track generation to load through contracts.
Okay, I'll start. This is Rich. Hi, Sonia. First, I think I disagree with the conclusion that the cost to ratepayers is the same, because the premium you were going to pay for clean generation under a carbon cap is the same as the premium that you pay to all generation under a carbon tax. And so I'm just going to pause there for a moment and and say that this is an important question, and I don't think it's been modeled, although I do agree with PG&E's position that it depends on how power is regulated in a given market, the degree to which this is true or not. The second point goes to the question of whether you can track megawatt hours from their generator to the load. And here we might just need to work through some details, and this is probably too long. This is not the place to do that. But a lot of megawatt hours are bilaterally committed, and those megawatt hours that are either owned by a utility or bilaterally committed to the utility are pretty easy to track to that utility. To the extent that there are then sort of complicated third-party transactions and wholesale markets and this and that, the only question is, can you create a tag that is, let's just do it in two options. Option one is the tag stays with the megawatt hour, so that when a megawatt hour is generated, a tag is created for it, and that tag is flows with the megawatt hour through every transaction that occurs. And lots of people say, sure, you can do that. It isn't being done today, but it could be done, and it would be done if there were economic reasons to do it. The second version is that you alluded to, is to create a carbon attribute that would be generated separately from or along with the megawatt hour, and then could be traded separately. Like RECs, renewable energy credits, can be traded separately from the power that renewable project is delivering. And in that instance, I just see two markets. I don't see three. I see a carbon tag, which is the same as a carbon credit, being traded separately from the power. And I believe you could do that too, just the same way, analogous to the way we trade RECs. So, and then it seems to me that you're in a situation where bilaterally those tags, under bilateral contracts, the tags just go to the buyer of the power. And then what's left is what's traded through the pool. The way that could operate is that as megawatt hours are sold into the day-ahead market or to the spot market, let's say the 20% or so of power that's traded that way, the tag is put into the market along with the power and is traded separately. And so you could have a one-to-one correspondence between megawatt hours and tags, which would ensure that at the end of the day, every megawatt hour that's sold is associated with a tag that was also sold.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take the next question. I'm going to ask the questioner to keep it brief. We've got just a little over 10 minutes left, and we still have quite a few written questions. Again, if you want to get into the queue, it's *1, and please go ahead and ask your question. Hello?
I think you're on.
This is Salmia again. I didn't enter twice.
Okay. We will then try. We will go ahead then and take one of the other questions from the written ones. Let me take the following one, and I'm not sure who, Rich or Dallas, who wants to answer this. But someone's writing to say that he's concerned that under a load-serving entity system, that allocation is going to penalize areas that have growing population or growing demand. So the location will be fixed on power use at some particular point in time, but if the service area starts losing population or basically losing population, then you meet your needs easily, and if the service area grows, then you're penalized. Anybody want to take that one on?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. I think this is now an allocation question, and if you think about it, this isn't really different. You may have the same problem with a generator-based system as with a load system in a rapidly growing state versus a slowly growing state. And the way I would propose to deal with it in a load side cap is, remember, well, we haven't said this yet, but I'm going to, for the sake of discussion, say that one of the nice things about a load side cap is that you can allocate allowance, the regulators can allocate allowances directly to the load-serving entities on behalf of the customers they serve without the necessity of an auction. So you avoid the entire auction process in a load side cap. Now, because the point here is that the carbon credits belong, in essence, to the public, and if we were selling them at an auction, we'd be wanting to return the revenues to the public. Since the load-serving entities are regulated and they serve the public, you can give them the allowances. So that's one of the main advantages of a load side cap. Now, the load-serving entity receiving the allowances can then live within, spend the allowances in order to meet their budget. And now the question is, well, gee, on what basis are those credits going to be allocated? Are they going to be allocated to load-serving entities in some way that reflects differing economic conditions or different growth patterns? And the answer is, of course they can be. That is, if some service territory is growing rapidly and ends up representing a bigger fraction of a state or a region's total emissions over time, or a total consumption over time, the formula for allocating allowances on day one of every year can reflect that. The formula can also reflect other circumstances, including historic consumption patterns, which entities historically have relied on highly emitting resources and which haven't, that kind of thing.
Okay. Let's see. There's just so many good questions here. I want to commend you all, actually, the listeners, because there are a great number of good questions. There's one here about, well, actually, we've heard from Rich a lot. Dallas, I wonder if there's anything you want to just jump in here and say.
Well, no, yes, I would like to summarize where I guess a point on from a historic perspective, Rich has argued that that the regulatory framework is a good one for trying to achieve emission reductions, and the regulatory framework being, the legacy that we have with the structure of public utility commissions and all that. But when it comes to the treatment of environmental programs, I don't think the track record is very good with respect to the role of PUCs, especially at a national level. California stands out. Oregon stands out. And even in those states, it took quite a while, but the last couple decades, it's been good. At a national level, it's been pretty bad. And, SO2 emission reductions, there was a lot of effort by advocates at the state level for a decade or two, and to try to do something about acid precursors and particulate emissions, and it finally took legislation with the federal cap-and-trade program to get what was really binding emission reductions on the industry. So that's why environmental advocates have adopted the phrase, sort of the mantra, the polluter pays principle. The idea is that in the long run, the best framework for dealing with these kind of environmental problems is to impose the cost on the polluter and in this context, in the context of the electricity market, I think that polluter is the generator, but it is also the case that consumers have an important behavioral response is necessary, and they have to assume responsibility in the long run. If we're going to achieve 50 to 80% reductions in our carbon emissions by the year 2050, then coddling electricity consumers by preventing them from seeing changes in electricity prices in the long run is not going to work. And I think there's some short-run political virtue to getting started to trying to soften that, because it doesn't make any economic sense to just, on a drop of a dime, try to jack up electricity prices, but putting the expectation in place that when people think about appliance purchases, new air conditioners, their lighting fixtures, etc., in new home construction in the long run, they should recognize that electricity is not going to be a special commodity compared to transportation fuels and natural gas fuels in the economy. So the point, 3 or 4 years ago, I was in a forum with 80 mid-level electric utility executives, and someone at the front suggested one way to go was an auction, and the room literally broke out in laughter, and I tried to hide in the collar of my coat. But now we see, due in part to the 6 of the 10 states so far in the Northeast are doing 100% auction around RGGI. The inside word on the energy plan for Europe is that for 2013 they want to auction 100% of the emission allowances in the electricity sector in Europe. And even the Lieberman-Warner bill, not probably the one that's going to ultimately pass inside the Beltway in 2009 when something finally does pass. I don't think it'll be Lieberman and Warner who are the architects of what that'll look like. That has already gone up to calling for a 30% auction by 2015, and all the Democratic candidates have called for a 100% auction. So if the Western Climate Initiative really wants to send a signal to Congress, it would do what I think it would do what the Northeast states has done, which is to put in place a rigorous caps system with a good, simple architecture and nice market design, and insist on an allocation approach that avoided the windfall profits for the reason that the person from PG&E mentioned previously, which is the free allocation of emission allowances. But having said that, I don't want to try to dump the baby out the window here with respect to the load-based approach, because if you were going to do a source-based approach and it was going to be a free giveaway of emission allowances like occurred in the first phase in Europe, then I would much sooner see a load-based approach in the Western states, and there's a variety of reasons for that. So it's really, this is not the reason Rich and I can keep having this endless discussion and keep learning from each other is that it's not that one system is absolutely worse and one system is absolutely best. There's a lot of judgment and political judgment and policy context that has to be taken into account. And there are some ways in which a source-based approach is much, much worse than a load-based approach, if you ask me. And there's some ways with a load-based approach is a real problem for the long run compared to the first best approach we could get if we were regulating generators. So that's why this is a complicated conversation.
That was actually a wonderful summary. There are a couple of more questions. I want to take the one last oral question and hope the person can be fairly succinct. And we have just 2 minutes left, so go ahead.
There's a question.
Okay, so it turned out that person was already off the line. And then the last question I will pose to each of you is, someone asks, since the renewable projects and their RECs have different carbon footprints, would it make sense to unbundle carbon from a general REC and look at them separately? And you've touched on that in some ways, but I wonder if someone wants to take that one on.
This is Rich. I can answer that simply. The answer is yes. Renewable energy credits are different from carbon credits, and so they would have to be treated separately. It may be that over time, policymakers would decide that if you have an adequate carbon market, that you don't need, in addition to that, to have a renewable portfolio standard. But there are other reasons to do renewables, and so there may be reasons to do both.
Okay. Well, let me just, then we have just a few minutes, and I'm actually going to close it here. I think that Dallas's remarks were actually a very good summary of what the issues are, and I think that I'll refer participants also to the slides. There's the nice side-by-side comparison that was at the end of Rich's presentation that I think actually summarizes very nicely what the differences are in people's opinions here. It's a very complicated, very interesting discussion back and forth, and let me thank both Rich Cowart and Dallas Bertroff for, again, bringing forward their very articulate thinking and just the goodwill that they bring forward in trying to come to a good solution and to help the states and stakeholders to think about these issues as they're going forward to design. Let me thank you all. There's still 50 people online, which is great. And just wanted to remind you that the presentations are already in your mailbox, so you can go back to them and look. And in those presentations are both Rich and Dallas's email addresses if you have more detailed questions that haven't been handled here. Thank you very much for your participation in this presentation and also in the other webinars. Let me just remind you that the next presentation, we're going to be skipping time for the holidays. The next presentation will be on Tuesday, January 8th, and it's covering cap-and-trade design issues in depth, looking at the U.S. and Canadian acid rain programs and the NOx trading programs with Brian McLean from the U.S. EPA, Denny Ellerman from MIT, and John Hutchison from the province of Ontario. Anyone who's not registered for that one can go back to the website and register. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. So talk to you next time.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Dallas.
Thank you.